Good afternoon, everyone. I am very happy to be here with you this afternoon for this segment of the Legal Aid Fair. My name is Tamiko Smith. I'm an attorney at law and an associate tutor here at the Legal Aid Clinic, and I am very excited to introduce to you this next segment, which is on the law, climate change, and you. Now, what we have often taken for granted is how deeply interconnected environmental sustainability is with law. As we have seen in very recent events, the instability of climate change tends to disproportionately affect vulnerable populations. Today, we have some law students who will be speaking with a number of very esteemed guests to discuss the matter forward, and I'd love to hand over to your moderator today, Tia James, to introduce them.
Good afternoon, everybody. At this time, I wish to extend a warm welcome to you all for being here with us this afternoon for our presentation, The Law, Climate Change, and You. And at this time, I will ask Mr. Gavin Champany to come forward to introduce our panelists that we have here with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. So this afternoon, we'll be having two speakers who will be presenting to us some valuable information. Our first presenter is Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis. She's a former general counsel at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus, and former director of the Legal Enforcement and Regulatory Branch at the National Environment and Planning Agency, NEPA. A former chief officer at the Natural Resource Environment Conservation Authority. She's an adjunct lecturer in International and Caribbean Environmental Law in the Faculty of Law and Policy for National Resource Management in the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies. She has extensive experience in environmental governance, having represented Jamaica at the international conferences, including part of negotiation team, inclusive of serving on the legal and technical commission of the International Seabed Authority from 2007 to 2013. A resource focused on rights of nature, climate justice, the law of the sea, and sustainable development issues facing small island Caribbean states, for example, Jamaica. She has contributed significantly to Jamaica's sponsoring status under the UN class, that's the United Nations Conservation Committee, and is a member of the International Code Project, which evaluates draft regulations of the International Seabed Authority. Mrs. Davis Mattis has published widely on ocean policy, fisheries management, and deep seabed mining. She has delivered presentations at leading academic, university, and policy fora worldwide. She has also served on Jamaica Constitutional Reform Committee and maintains emerging interest in the role of artificial intelligence and the art of advancing environmental education and sustainable development. She is chair of the National Council on Reparation and in the role is a member of the CARICOM Reparation Commissions. Our next presenter will be Professor Michael Taylor. Professor Taylor, Professor Michael Taylor is a professor in, in climate science and dean of the Faculty of Science and Technology at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. He is the co-director of the Climate Studies Group Mona, a research body which explores climate variability and change for the Caribbean region. He is well published and is cited for his scientific research on the impact of climate change on the small islands of the Caribbean region. He is a coordinating lead author on the special report on 1.5 degree of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a Silver Musgrave Awardee for Science in 2013, and the 2019 ANSA Caribbean Laureate for Excellence in Science. In 2001, he was named amongst the political 100 most influential academics in government globally. Most recently, he authored a chapter in Greta Thunberg, The Climate Change book. Professor Michael Taylor He's a fellow of the Caribbean Academy of Sciences as well as the World Academy of Sciences. At this moment, I now welcome Professor Michael Taylor.
So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I have to tell you, I feel so intimidated. I'm a fish out of water. I'm a scientist, as you have heard, and I'm not sure what I'm doing speaking here at all. But I've been asked to lay a little bit of a context, and so what I'm going to try to do is set a context about why should you even be talking about climate change. And I want to do it using that title, Talking Climate Change After the Storm. But as I said, let me begin by saying, listen, I'm a Caribbean climate scientist. That's exactly who I am. And what that means, the Caribbean in there is very important because it means that I talk climate change from a small island developing state lens. That's how I do my science, and that's how I interpret the science. What is that lens? Well, it turns out it's actually the lens of societies that are extremely climate sensitive. And that's exactly what we are. Why are we so climate sensitive? You could tell me the reasons, but one, we do outdoor living. It's very simple. Daily life is structured to take advantage of ambient conditions. So whether you think about it or not, climate is immediately a part of you and your everyday, everything that you do every day. But two, we are extremely natural resource dependent. Development is linked to climate sensitive economies, so you can think about it. It's agriculture, it's tourism, it's water. If we do not get rain, we do not have water. But then it's also things like health, and so all of these important sectors are strongly natural resource dependent. We are flat, low-lying, and mountainous. So we have one of two places to live. We're either living on a narrow coastline, and the problem with a narrow coastline is when you get a big storm and it pushes inland flooding, that's your challenge. Or you're living on a steep hillside. And the problem, of course, with a steep hillside is that when you get heavy rain, all right, you know that. So that further puts us in. And then the last thing is that we're small, isolated, and exposed. We're in a hurricane belt, and we're small enough to be engulfed by an entire hurricane. And so there is nowhere to run. Put that together, climate is inherently a part of us. We can't escape it. We're these extremely sensitive societies. And so we have to view climate science through that lens. So climate is not just how much hotter we're going to get. It's science viewed through that lens. Were this last year before Melissa, I would then say, so my title of my presentation is Talking Climate Change from a SIDS lens. And I would say, all I want to offer you is 3 insights about what climate change is, so that I set the context for Lalita, who is coming next. But last year we had a major event. We had Melissa. And Melissa was extremely significant from a climate perspective. So you know about Melissa. It came October 28th, and it was the strongest storm on record to make landfall in Jamaica, far exceeding Hurricane Gilbert. And I can give you all the numbers, but you know them already. And so I'm changing my title a little bit to say, let's talk climate change from a SIDS lens after Melissa, because Melissa was a game-changing event. And so what I want to do is still offer you 3 insights, but not 3 insights about what climate change is. 3 insights about climate change is not, and how Melissa confirmed it. So very quickly, very simply, from a science perspective, here are 3 things, insights about what climate change is not, and how Melissa has confirmed it. The first thing that climate change is not from the science perspective is this. It is not just a future threat. It is equally a present crisis. Let me say it again. First thing, climate change is not just a future threat. It is equally a present crisis. The challenge we have when we talk climate change, especially when I get up to talk climate change, people, if they don't walk out of the room because it's a scientist talking, they say, well, that's something that doesn't have to bother me. It's a future threat. Truthfully, it is, and the science makes it very clear. It is a future threat. In fact, what the science says, when you read it through a SIDS lens, is climate change is all about a future of the unprecedented. And the unprecedented becomes important. What do I mean? If you think you're hot now, even hotter times are ahead. All right? And the two little diagrams are there. You just follow the black diagram, and that's how our temperatures have been going. But as you go to the end of the century, you don't even have to be able to read it. What you can notice is that the number of hot days in our region, that's our science read through our lens, approaches 98% of the days in a year. So by the time we hit the end of the century, 98% of the days will be hot, where we consider hot by current standards. Worse, 98% of the nights will be hot by current standards. So, future, absolutely a future threat, because we're going to be hot, and we're going to be hot in ways that we have not lived through before. 98% hot. Truth is, we're going to be drier. And this is what we call a rain map. And all you have to know is that in the vertical is January to December. And then as you go, it's from now going to the end of the future. And all you can see is that brown getting deeper and deeper and spreading wider and wider. We are heading for a period when we're going to be at least 40% drier than we are now. And the drying is going to be in the middle of the year. That's where the brown ends up by the time you go towards the end of the century. And that is, of course, when we get our rainfall season. It is a future of the unprecedented. We're heading for even higher sea levels than we have sea level rise and we have seen, up to 1 meter. And I want you to remember that. And then we, of course, are heading for more intense extremes. This is a little table that just tells you the percentage of time we are in any kind of drought. All right, so we can talk about moderate, extreme, or severe drought, and the totals are at the bottom. By the 2030s, 17% of the time we will be in one of these drought conditions. By the time you hit the 2060s, 26% of the time we will be in one of these drought conditions. And by the time you hit the end of the century, we're gone 34% of the time. Real simple point that I am making. In the future, absolutely climate change is a future threat. And the threat is the threat of the unprecedented science or climate as we have not lived through before. And that is the challenge. However, I am arguing that that's not the only way we must think about climate change. Melissa has taught us that that climate change is not just a future threat, it is a present crisis. But the science had also shown us that it was a present crisis, because the science of climate change, when read through our lens, tell us that we are already living in a challenged present. I don't have to ask you if you feel hot. You feel hot. And the challenge now is that we went through a little bit of a cold front the other day, and we began to say, oh, beautiful. But there are nights now, right now, in end of February into March, where we're feeling hot and we're wondering what on earth is happening. Well, that's the spreading of the heat in the heat map. Same kind of map, but this is now temperatures. And that is 1950 to present. And what have you noticed? The heat simply has spread out for a greater portion of the year. We have up to 23 more really, really, really hot days in a year. And the question is, where are those days going? We expect it to be hot in summer. Well, it just means summer is starting earlier and last and going longer. And we not only have hot days, but we have hot nights. And the challenge with the hot nights is you come into a beautiful AC room like this during the day, is when you go home and you have to run the fan. And then what you do? You don't get up in the middle of the night and turn it off. Why did I ever assume you have fan? Let's say the AC, sorry. You don't get up in the middle of the night because your plan is to put it on a time and it will go off after three hours, but you're running it straight through the night. So it's not just a future crisis. Right now we are feeling it. The truth is we're also feeling it in our rainfall already. And that's the rainfall map. And what you notice that 1 year it's up, and the next year it's down, and then the next year it's up, and the next year it's down. And we lose the predictability of the rainfall season. But also, rain falls in a completely different way now than how we used to know it. We get long, dry spells, and then when it rains, boy, it rained. So we know it's already a present crisis. That's the flash flooding. We're also seeing it in extreme droughts. Since 2009, we have had two multi-year, multi-country droughts throughout the region. 2013 to 2016 is one of the famous ones. 3 years of drought in the region, so severe that none of us knew where we were getting water from. It's a present crisis. And then in the higher sea levels, that's Negril Beach. And if you can see the dotted line, that's where the beach of Negril was in 1971. There's a little green dotted line in the ocean. And you don't even have to see it, because all of us know one place in Jamaica that we can point to and say, I remember when that place in the sea was on the... You want to talk about Hellshire? All right? So we know it's already a present crisis, and the challenge of the crisis is that we're getting all of these things at the same time, or what science tells us is we're living in a multi-hazard era. So it's not that we're getting the hot, and then when the hot decide to give us a break, next year we get the rain. We're getting them all at the same time, and that's the real challenge. So it's already a present crisis. Let me push it one step further. If you know about climate change, and I know you do, you will know that the region lobbied hard for 1.5 degrees to be the limit of global warming by the end of this century. Let me say that again. The region lobbied that we must not warm more than 1.5 degrees by the end of the current century. So much so that that made it into the famous climate change agreement, the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement says, oh, as a world, we won't go more than 2 degrees by the end of the century, but we will aspire to 1.5 degrees, because we have some small islands out there who say 1.5 must be the limit. This is a science we do to say what 1.5 degrees, if we reached 1.5, would mean. So it would mean less hydropower in Suriname. We'd have damages from storms 2 to 3 times more. We'd have diminished agricultural, and we'd have coastal inundation. And that was part of the science to make the case that we can't warm more than 1.5 degrees. Not that 1.5 is safe for us. That's 1.5. But we say we can't go over that. Well, you want to see that climate is already an already challenge present. That's the global temperatures. And those last 3 lines tell us that in 2024, we exceeded 1.5 degrees. Wait. But that was supposed to be at the end of the century. And you'll notice that 2025 and 2023, we only don't call it 1.5, though we normally round up. It was 1.47. So we are now flirting at the edge of 1.5 degrees. This is an urgent challenge. So climate is not just a future threat, it is a present crisis. All right, but Melissa, I argue that Melissa changes the narrative. Melissa actually confirms this science that climate change is not just a future threat, it's a present crisis. How? It turns out we have been having a string of what we would call unprecedented storms. 2017, unprecedented, we said, because we had 3 Category 5 hurricanes in the region, Irma, Maria, and Jose. Can't be any more unprecedented. Well, then we go into 2019, and we had Dorian, the superstorm that sat and didn't move. And we said, no, that is unprecedented. And then we had 2020, when we exhausted the alphabet, and we had to start naming storms alpha, beta, gamma. And we said, no, that is unprecedented. And then we had 2024, which was Beryl. And Beryl was so unprecedented because it came at the beginning of the hurricane season. And we have never had a Category 5 storm at the beginning of the hurricane season, And we call that unprecedented. And then came Melissa in 2025. And we redefined unprecedented once again. Because in truth, Melissa is a tomorrow's storm today. It's a storm that we thought that we would never have seen yet, but we are now seeing it today. And that is a huge challenge, right? How is Melissa so unprecedented? Well, record sea surface temperatures. We've never had record sea surface temperatures like that. Sorry, I'm just borrowing some of your water. And it's not because the room is hot and unprecedented. All right? Never had it. But Melissa formed in an environment that we had not expected to see yet in our lifetime. Then there was rapid intensification. Melissa went from a storm to a category 5. And the kind of rapid intensification is what we were predicting for the future. Same thing with the wind strength. Same thing with the rainfall. Melissa was a tomorrow's storm today. So Melissa confirmed for us that climate is not just a future threat, it's a present crisis. But one more thing before I leave that point. Why do I say crisis? Well, look on that table. That's the table of all those hurricanes and droughts that have impacted Jamaica from 2000 to present. And you only want to look at those last columns over there, the cost in GDP cost. Well, in 2000 we had a drought and it cost us 0.2%. Then we had Hurricane Michelle in 2001, 0.7%. We had flood rains in 2002, 0.6%. We didn't have anything in 2003, so Charlie and Ivan made up for it in 2004, especially Ivan with the 6.8%. And then what you notice, 5, 7, 8, 10, 12, 14, all the way down. And so I'm sorry that the plant is blocking you. Because you have to see that when we had Beryl cost us 1.1%. And Beryl was just 13 months before Melissa, which cost us 41% of our GDP. Climate change is not just a future threat, it's a present crisis. So, let me sum up that. I read science through the lens of a small island developing state. Science says climate change is not just a future threat, but a present crisis. The scale of Melissa confirms this. It was a tomorrow storm today. What do I want you to take away? Listen, we have to acknowledge that the range of implications of climate change span from the now forward. It's not just a future thing. Very quickly, second insight that climate change is not talking climate change after the storm. 2, climate change is not just about physical loss. It's about people's lives. That's the second insight that you get when you read science through a SIDS lens. What do I mean? I heard it in the introduction. Small islands suffer disproportionately higher climate-induced loss. But when we're talking those losses, we're talking infrastructure, we're talking things that we can quantify. And that's why the IMF produces things like that. The middle one says we are 7 times, where are the red bars, all the red bars. We are 7 times more prone to disaster frequency than anywhere else in the world. And we are 6 times likely to get 6 times more damage in GDP than anywhere in the world. And we have the science that shows us that if a storm hits us, on average, it takes away about 17% of the GDP. But all we are costing out is infrastructure. So the science is true. We do suffer disproportionately higher. But the science also is emerging to show us that non-economic losses now represent the significant mounting risk for SIDS. Don't expect you to read the thing but on the left, but it was just trying to show you it maps the new emergence of non-economic losses for the Caribbean region. We're going into cultural and heritage losses, indigenous knowledge losses, biodiversity losses, human health and mental well-being losses, and you begin to see that it's no longer what we can cost, but it's also those non-economic losses. Wanted to illustrate this easily to you. I find that newspaper headlines represent the best science on the ground these days. I've been tracking newspaper headlines for the last couple of years. Here are the newspaper headlines. Here's what used to dominate the headlines, and these are all from the last 3 years. Costly waste leaves roads in a deplorable state. Say amen if you can relate. Costly, so heavy rains does that, right? But again, it's tracking infrastructure. 4.8 million tons of debris generated by Hurricane Melissa. I don't even think I need to ask you to say amen. Heatflation, sweltering heat is disrupting agriculture and it's costing us in terms of inflation. Or a beloved Jamaican beach is disappearing. That was about Hellshire. Or the one I like, rain mash up everything. Everything. But all of these headlines are really infrastructure. But what I've noticed in the last year or two is the sudden emergence of other kinds of headlines. Some of those classrooms are furnaces. And we begin to see that climate change is now education. It's not just the mashing up of a road. It's asking kids to do exams and learn in infrastructure that is not suited for that. And then we see other things, deadly heat stress. So farmers having to deal with that, or the sargassum problem. Or we begin to see things like Jamaican higglers feeling the heat, beginning to see it as livelihoods. Or extreme heat causing unsafe working conditions, or dengue fever now beginning to be a major threat. So climate change suddenly moves from infrastructure into human conditions. And what these headlines also are showing, and of course, Caribbean homeowners are bracing for increased insurance. Tell me amen if you know that your mortgage rate was increased last year, because I wanted to ask the panel that went before. The climate change, absolutely. But truth of what I'm trying to illustrate is this. We often think about climate change as a certain set of vulnerable people. And those vulnerable people are who? Farmers. Yes? And fishermen. But this is the new vulnerable. Climate change is creating a whole new set of vulnerable people. The poor, the elderly, the children, the health challenge, the physically challenged who, when the road is blocked, it's not easy for them to jump over. The students, the outdoor workers, the factory workers, the health workers, the coastal dwellers, middle income people, small business people. Climate change is expanding the number of vulnerable. So suddenly, climate change is not just about physical loss, it's about people's lives. Well, Melissa confirmed this easily. When Melissa just happened, we costed out the immediate damage. 385 roads were impacted, 195 corridors impassable, 631 of 763 NWC water systems, 5 major hospitals, you notice it's all infrastructure, 616 educational institutions, 77% of the island was without power, and only 35% of cell sites were operational, and 146,000 buildings. And that's how we decided we wanted to measure Melissa's impact. But we know that climate change isn't just about physical losses, because this is the headline. 50 days on, the country struggles to deal with the disruption from an unprecedented event. So once you begin to talk about continued disruption, it's about people's lives. That is the lost education of all of those students, the lost livelihoods, and you can stretch it to the fact that even the future generation is impacted, because kids who abandon their education now, their social mobility in the future is impacted. And so you begin to see that the solutions being proffered aren't only infrastructure. But I think you get the point very quickly. So when I read science through a small island developing lens, hey, climate isn't just about physical losses, it's also about people's lives. Melissa confirmed it by the unfolding scope of it's moved from immediate damage to continued disruption. You know what we have a responsibility to do, and I hope this is what this session will bring. Consider the range of impacts. and they span economic to non-economic. We have to consider the non-economic. They are being left out of the conversation. Last thing, so if science tells me that climate change is not just a future threat, but a present crisis, if it tells me that it's not just about physical losses, but about people's lives, the third thing it tells me is this: it's not just about technical solutions, it's about hard choices. Why do I say that? The science is very clear. A range of solutions are needed. And we can tell you the range of solutions. We know we have to adapt, so we need a strong mitigation agenda. What is let me reach before mitigation. We know we need a strong mitigation agenda. What is mitigation? It's reducing the greenhouse gases. So we have to slow that 1.5 degree increase. And the only way to slow it is to reduce the greenhouse gases. What does that mean for us? Well, here are the 5 ways we can mitigate. We can change energy source. We can deal with waste. We have to deal with transportation. Oceans and forests are the things. Those are the only ways we can contribute to mitigation. And we know those solutions have to be there. But even if we mitigate, we're still heading for a hotter future. We're sailing past the 1.5. And we can have a discussion on what we should do then. And so we need unavoidable adaptation. And because it's across all sectors, we have to adapt across all sectors. So we need different livelihoods that are not solely dependent on things that are climate sensitive. And we need agriculture to be different, and we need to build differently. And then we need policies that protect to the most vulnerable and then enforce them. See defenses, and you can go right through. And there's a whole range of other solutions needed. We need a structured education agenda about climate change. We need a contextual research agenda. Invite me back one day and we'll talk about what research is really needed in climate change and where you fall in that research. We need a deliberate collaborative agenda. Climate change isn't one set of people's responsibilities. It's not only government responsibility. It's all of us. And we need a robust finance agenda. And we can talk about that. Because all of that together builds resilience. So the science is clear. We do need technical solutions. We need absolutely different development agendas. But the truth is, every single one of these comes with extremely hard questions. And the science says that. So if we're going for solar energy, here's a whole host of questions. Let me just read the first one. If everybody goes solar and energy prices go up for those who can't afford to go solar, because JPS will have to generate this electricity anyway. And if everybody who can afford it go off the grid, then who is left to pay for it? Is that fair? If we talk about adaptation, here is one question. Which coastlines get protected first? Is it the industrial shorelines or the fishing villages? The North Coast with the hotel. So go for the hotels first. Forget the little man who is fishing. That's well. So it comes with these really difficult questions. Let's talk about collaboration. Do we slow projects just to get the community voice? Or do we say, listen, it's self-evident. We have to do this project to protect you. So forget the community. They will hopefully agree somewhere down the line. Or the finance agendas. If we are so convinced climate change is affecting us, then shouldn't we refuse relief finance if it comes with strings attached? Or should we refuse it from certain countries because they are the worst emitters? The point is, the science also says, yeah, we know the technical solution, but the technical solutions are not so easy. They come with lots of hard questions. They come with questions about trade-offs, and it's a very simple thing. Decisions about where to invest, rebuild, retreat, or protect first have to be made. And when you make those decisions, there's a risk of uneven outcomes. Some communities are going to be disadvantaged, overlooked, or come on at the end stream. How we make those decisions? There are equity and justice concerns. Who pays, who benefits, and who waits, is a big question, especially the who waits. Do we protect the hotel and say, well, they're going to develop the economy, so let's protect them, and we let everybody else wait? There are intergenerational implications, and of course, there's need for collective solidarity. So, there's this higher level expectation that is really expected of governance now, because climate change isn't only about technical solutions. We have to talk about fairness, solidarity, equity, justice, safeguarding the most vulnerable. I end by saying, listen, Melissa only confirmed that. Melissa confirmed that climate change is not just about technical solutions, it's about hard choices. Here is the conversations, and it did it by its setback. When we look on Melissa, we never imagined the setback would have ever been what we saw. And so when you hear the conversations, immediately after, these were the conversations. Should the electrical grid be underground? Technical solution. Should a slab roof or hurricane straps be non-negotiable? Didn't we hear these questions? Technical solution. Should evacuation be mandatory? Technical solution. And we can see it. We agree, Melissa confirmed that technical solutions are needed. But look how the questions have evolved. Who is accountable for schools repaired after Beryl failing so badly in Melissa? Now we begin to talk about hard questions. In the rush to rebuild, who is ensuring that building standards are improved? Are we just giving everybody a roof grant and then build and that's it? Are we satisfied that nobody is being left out with current aid distribution mechanisms? Who is checking? So Melissa confirms climate change is not just about technical solutions, it's about hard choices. So I end. Listen, I read science through the lens of small island development. When you read it, it's very clear. Science says climate change is not just a future threat, but a present crisis. And so we have to acknowledge that the implications run from now to the end. Science says climate change is not just about physical losses, but it's really about people's lives. And that's what the science says. So we have to consider that the range of impacts span economic and non-economic. We have to pay attention to the non-economic. We're not doing so. But science also says that climate change is not just about technical solutions, but also about hard choices. Melissa's unbelievable setback made us know that. And it means that we have to tackle the range of issues related to climate change that span infrastructural through justice. And in the end, because you're going to forget everything I said because I'm a scientist, just simply remember, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, consider, and tackle, which is to act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Taylor. I think we can all agree that it was a very informative presentation, and we now have a better understanding of how real climate change is and the effects, and also the role that we can play in assisting to lessen some of the impacts of climate change. Can you give him another round of applause, please? All right, thank you. At this time, I would ask you to join me in giving a warm welcome to Mrs. Lalita Davis Mattis, who I'm sure is no stranger to us here.
Thank you. And first, let me say, Professor Taylor, thank you. I think what Melissa has also done is to change the narrative on what climate jurisprudence is. Because when you look at the development of the law to date, there's a lot of focus on specific areas of law, and we'll get into that as well. But I think what the discussion is also very informative in the sense that a lot of those other issues that you have raised will now have to inform the development of the law. So when Professor Taylor sat first and said he feels out of place, I said in our field, we always talk about the legal and the technical experts because you don't develop law and policy without the expertise of the technical persons. And in the era of climate change and environmental law, science always plays a very critical role. So the picture here shows kids, and that represents intergenerational equity. And Professor Taylor also mentioned the role of future generations, which is something that we say, but not so necessarily easy to understand how to talk about generations yet unborn? How do you plan for populations in the next 30 years? And so the whole discussion about climate change being futuristic, but in fact, that is a misnomer because we're talking about what's happening to us now. So, is climate change a hoax? So Professor Taylor spoke about his lens being looking through the eyes of a scientist in Jamaica as a small island developing state. And remember, too, that when it comes down to global climate change, our contribution to global climate change is negligible as small island developing states. So the question is, again, how do what is it for us to change? So we all know that the President Trump on the 12th of February announced that he was erasing, and those are the words, erasing the scientific finding that climate change endangers human health and the environment, ending the federal government's legal authority to control the pollution that is dangerously heating the planet. And so all of his presentation was about overheating, 1.5 to stay alive. By the way, there's a nice song online that speaks to 1.5 to stay alive when small island developing states went to the COP the year. Now, I won't bother to go into this, but this is really what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has defined as climate change. So, coming to the region, Antigua and Barbuda. So the region really has been also very active. And even when the whole issue of the 1.5 to stay alive came about, the Caribbean countries were extremely active and agile in those discussions. So as part of what Antigua and Barbuda did, and they also were very agile in the discussions and even in the development of their own environmental legal framework, they are also very agile. They have one of the most recent Environmental Planning and Management Act in the region, being 2019. So there was an issue with the International Court of Justice seeking an advisory opinion on the obligations of states in respect of climate change. And they also went to the ITLOS, which is the tribunal under the Law of the Sea Convention. So what happened was they also developed the Commission on Small Island States and Climate Change and International Law. And we see here where the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and this other island, yes, that signed this agreement to take the matter to the international courts. In terms of going to the tribunal, the tribunal noted, and this is part of the judgment, that the United Nations General Assembly recognized for the first time climate change is a common concern of mankind. It concerns everybody. And these are international principles that when you do international environmental law, for example, you will learn. It's a common concern of mankind. And the General Assembly stated that the emerging evidence indicates that continued growth in atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. And Professor Taylor again spoke to greenhouse gas emissions and the need to control those. And it talks about could produce global warming with an eventual rise in sea levels, the effects of which could be disastrous for mankind. Well, it's no longer futuristic because it's here. We are seeing it for ourselves. I'll just go through just a few of the questions. What are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases for states and for, again, present and future generations? I'm just going to skip down. States, including in particular small island developing states, which is due to their geographical circumstances and level of development, are injured or specifically affected or are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. And we could go on. But these are, I just realized I spelled advisor wrong, so you have to forgive me. So these are real questions that were posed to the International Tribunal. Now, in terms of the opinion, the tribunal held that states parties to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea are under an obligation to adopt all necessary measures in order to prevent, reduce, and control marine pollution caused by greenhouse gas. Remember, law of the sea has to do with law of the sea, the oceans. And it says this obligation goes beyond what is actually required of states under specific climate change treaties, such as the Climate Change Convention. And we are talking about climate change in 2026. The convention is 1992. So in other words, it's as if we are catching up with the science. And because we are talking about climate change from 1992 and talking about climate change from in a futuristic perspective, we're in 2026 experiencing what we had projected to happen, as Professor Taylor is saying, at the end of a century. So again, the tribunal indicated that there are still obstacles to tort-like claims that greenhouse gas emissions by one state have caused damage to another state. I mean, most of us did public international law. We know about the trail smelter case that talks about your responsibility to contain your own pollution in your own country, liability for transboundary harm. It goes on to talk about the opinion, and I will skip that because I can send you the slide if you want. But the whole point is the role of states. Now, the first slide asks, what do we want to change? When Jamaica first started the discussion, now, I don't want to say started, when we were talking about climate change policy and climate change law, there was a slogan, with climate change, we must change. And then we always ask ourselves, change what? So Professor Taylor, for example, said, it's not only a state responsibility. So you ask yourself, what is your responsibility? So I usually ask students, when we get up in the mornings, how do I mitigate and adapt to climate change? Professor Taylor also spoke about the industries that we have. What are we going to prioritize? When he brought that slide with all these questions, are we going to prioritize tourism because that's your largest earner of GDP? What are you going to do? We talk about water, and we also spoke about the expansion of the notion of vulnerable communities. Now, I also want to add to say that climate change is no respecter of persons. If you don't have water, you don't have water. And if you don't have water, but you have money in your pocket, you still can't buy water. So these are some of the things that we have to consider. So even the categories of persons who are affected by global climate change, those categories are expanding. And Hurricane Melissa has proven that. When Hurricane Melissa came, and as the article said, mash up the West mash up. Everybody, you don't have light. And if you had solar, many of those infrastructure were gone anyway. So it's the issue is, what is my obligation? So the opinion from the tribunal had to do with the responsibility of states. And remember, states are bound at international law. At some point, they have to pass it on to us as citizens. But what are they going to pass on to us? What are they telling us to do? Are you going to tell me, for example, to conserve water? Are you going to say that to the hotel industry? Are you going to say to the hotel industry that between certain hours of the day you can't have water? Then perhaps you won't have tourists. You know, Professor Taylor mentioned the Negril coastline. And there's a whole issue, again, of access to marine resources and how that fits into this climate dialogue that we are having as small island developing states. Do we have access? I took a class of students to St. Thomas, I think about a year or so ago, and one man said, I am trapped on my own island. Because if I want to leave, I can't just leave. In other words, if you want to leave by sea, it's not easy to leave by sea because where's the access? Many of the access points are gone. So we actually have a dilemma. There's a whole notion about climate refugees as well. Where are you going to go? Who is going to take us? I always ask my students, who is going to take us? Who is going to say, the Jamaicans can come over here? Who is going to do that? At least we may have some mountains that we can resort to without the landslide. All right, so the whole discussion now on climate change, there's another discussion now on climate litigation, and the question is, what is that? Can you discuss climate outside of the environment? So what is environmental law? Environmental law generally will relate to what affects the natural environment, public health, it means us. When you look at your constitutional rights, in most countries, constitutional rights are accorded to us as people. So we have rights, and the state has responsibilities to ensure that we can assert those rights, as well as the fact that sometimes in some jurisdictions, citizens also have rights to ensure that other persons' constitutional rights are not infringed. In some countries, nature is given rights. So nature itself has rights. For example, like in Ecuador, nature, Mother Earth, is an entity with rights. So we talk about natural rights for natural objects and natural resources. So there also are obligations to protect those, to protect Mother Nature as an entity, almost like giving Mother Nature legal standing, basically. That's really what it is. So that all Mother Nature would therefore need is someone to come on nature's behalf before a court of law. The same in which you have legal incompetence in law, that you need someone, some adult, to take the action on that person's behalf. So also, what is climate legislation? So can you develop law and policy about climate alone without having it under the rubric of environmental law? My view is that climate litigation is a subset of environmental law. That's my view. But there are different schools of thought in terms of what are the peculiarities of climate litigation or climate jurisprudence that make it climate as opposed to environment. So it's a mixed bag. But my view at this point is, in the absence of any specific legislation dealing with climate, you can use the existing environmental regime to address climate-related matters. So you don't have to wait, because most of the umbrella type legislation in any event allow you to do so much in terms of managing the environment, people, and public health. So it's an emerging body of environmental law to further climate change mitigation efforts. It describes lawsuits filed before international, domestic, judicial, or quasi-judicial bodies, raising questions of law or fact regarding climate science, Professor Taylor, climate change mitigation and adaptation. And the litigation in this era really relies a lot on human rights. And when you look at the cases, a lot of them are based on administrative law as well as constitutional law. Administrative law, because you're challenging a decision of an authority to say that decision should not have been made. You did not take into account material consideration. The same thing you do with the administrative law. Or it may relate to constitutional law, where it has to do with what are my constitutional rights. I remember for Jamaica, our Bill of Rights were amended to give us constitutional rights as it relates to environment, for the environment. So in Latin America and the Caribbean, just to give examples, we have rights-based climate litigations. Colombia, for example, this is the Amazon now, the Amazon forest. And it says the court recognized the Amazon as a rights-bearing entity. So the forest itself, a rights-bearing entity, and ordered state action against deforestation. And then it says, whilst framed as environmental protection, the remedy directly targets major emissions driver, which is how the climate comes into that now. In terms of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, it established that environmental harm can violate human rights even beyond borders. And this provides a regional rights framework that can go on climate claims through environmental degradation, because it's all connected. When you looked at the presentation from Professor Taylor, most of the issues are environmental, but those environmental issues are really informed by the science connected with climate change and therefore climate rights as well. The Netherlands, the court required the state to increase emissions reductions based on human rights duties of care. And then now you're going to tort duty of care and all of that. This climate adjudication evaluates national mitigation ambition against scientific thresholds and international commitments. Then we have Germany here. Insufficient near-term mitigation violates intertemporal freedom by shifting disproportionate burdens to future generations. This is climate law's long horizon logic in constitutional form. So you look at, it's how you bring the various aspects of law to bear in terms of ensuring our climate rights. Now, I mentioned this convention here, which is recent, this regional agreement, and it's really dealing with access to information. This is a regional agreement for Latin America and the Caribbean. And how does it impact now this whole climate litigation issue and climate change? Protection of human rights defenders. Now, we may not have that in our part of the world, but in other parts of the world, human rights defenders are targets. So this convention actually addresses their rights as human rights defenders. In terms of the access, the convention speaks to access to environmental justice. And the law school here, for example, even in terms of the environmental law clinic that you have here, and the work that is being done in the clinic, is a facilitator in terms of the implementation. Jamaica has not yet ratified the agreement, but at the end of the day, we do have an Access to Information Act. But what the convention does is to ensure access, and not just access to information, but access to justice in a very real way. Because legal aid clinics normally don't deal with environmental cases. But this also based on so much hard science that you actually need a team of people as part of your litigation team. You barely go to court in an environmental matter, you don't have a scientist there to prove what it is that you are seeking to assert. Because just by way of example, many environmental, if it's an offense, the offense is usually using the same criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. That's usually the criminal standard used for environmental offenses. So you need a scientist to prove what's in there. And for most of the cases, I just give simple thing. Remember, if you want to prove that it's a tortoise shell, you can't just present it. You need to show what it is. If you are saying this is the derivative of something, you need a scientist to show that this is turtle meat, for example. And I use that example because turtles are protected and you should not have them. So you're not supposed to be drinking turtle soup. All right? All right. So, so in terms of we're talking about procedural rights and so on, and the whole notion of participation as well in decision making. So the notion in terms of environmental law and clearly climate litigation is that you must have public participation in your decision making. And in one of the slides that Professor Taylor showed as well, there was a question about it was the decision making, how the extent you involve the community or not. But the whole notion of access to information and public participation, it doesn't necessarily dictate that you have to comply with public concerns. You must give reasons why you are not going to comply with public concerns. And just to pause here, just to say, when it comes on to the environment and sustainable development is a concept that really says when you are making your decisions, you are to take environmental considerations into account. It doesn't say that you can't do anything without environmental consideration. And I say, for example, we drive on these wonderful highways in Jamaica. What was there before? Where did the birds go? No, they're really serious questions, but we take a lot of things for granted. And even when it comes onto the science behind climate change and how we do development in Jamaica, we talk about the role of mangroves, for example, and shoreline protection. But we remove them anyway in favor of development. And we perhaps remove them in favor of development because perhaps that is the imperative at the time. Maybe that is your development imperative. In order to eradicate poverty, for example. Because remember, governments have obligations. Government have obligations they have signed on to. One of them, not reduction, eradication of poverty. How do you eradicate poverty? If the poverty is an economic indicator, and I always say that, eradication of poverty doesn't mean you can buy a Porsche. Right? It's an economic indicator, but how do you eradicate poverty without development? It just can't happen. But how do you know what is the trade-off? What's the kind of development that you are going to have? What are the trade-offs here? Then I just go past that in terms of timely, accessible, and proactive disclosure of environmental information and so on. And you look at a lot of the environmental cases, and information like this will now be transferred over to climate litigation because persons are not informed of what is happening, and therefore you're challenging. So, for example, you see cases where you're challenging the EIA. And I also want to say that, for example, you talk about oil and gas law. So you have cases coming, for example, out of Guyana now that have to do with because of the oil and gas industry. And a lot of persons put that kind of litigation under climate litigation because of the whole notion of greenhouse gas emissions. But at the end of the day, much of the legislation is also under the Environmental Act, and it just shows the extent to which we can operate under existing legislative frameworks. All right, so this had to do with, for example, what's going on in the EU, similar issues here in terms of how different regions in the world are addressing climate-related matters and climate rights. Quickly now, I just want to focus a little bit on what Antigua has also done in terms of their legislation. And remember now, because topics become more popular, for want of a better word, then what you want to do is to include it in the legislation. So Antigua, for example, one of the functions of the Department of Environment is to coordinate the development and implementation of government sustainable development. Climate change is specifically identified in the legislation. It also goes again in terms of the minister. The minister has a responsibility to develop and promote a national environmental management strategy and policy to ensure the integration of all aspects of environmental management, including ozone depletion, climate change, hazardous waste, etc. So what you see here are a set of environmental sectors, environmental indicators, but climate change is a specifically mentioned environmental indicator. Again, the department is to coordinate the development and implementation of the government's sustainable development, climate change, environment and natural resources management policies and activities. So what Antigua and Barbuda has done is to include climate change and climate mitigation. In fact, they have also established a fund, and in that fund, you can also fund climate-related activities. So again, this is what the policy framework is supposed to is mandated to include, climate change. So what you have, if you look, these are what we would normally call environmental sectors: ozone, climate, chemicals management, biodiversity, desertification, which is what, again, Professor Taylor spoke about, which is all about drought, and trading endangered species, and such other focal areas. But in this 2019 piece of legislation, they ensure that they included climate as included. Then we also have here, again, the right to investigate, use and control and protect, etc. And again, climate is also included in these provisions right here. So we talk about hydroelectric, geothermal, navigation, fishing, preservation, etc. And it goes on to speak about the private sector, etc. And the role of government in regulating the environment and climate. This legislation also talks about carbon sinks. And what it does is to put carbon sinks as part of almost a protected area system, so that you can literally identify what your carbon sinks are and you can protect them. So in terms of climate litigation, we have agreed, well, maybe not agreed, but my submission is that climate litigation is a subset of environmental litigation, and we see the amount of cases now, most of them, for them to be climate related, have to do with greenhouse gas emissions and anything associated with that. So we're talking about over 3,000 climate related cases, and and Guyana happens to be one of those countries that actually do have cases that are classified as climate litigation. I'm going to just go quickly, and that's the fact that there are now what you call climate rights. So we have environmental rights, and now you have climate rights. And it has to do with the way in which national constitutions, human rights laws, so this is now the composite of the various areas of law coming together under one heading of climate rights. So we're talking about constitutional law, human rights law, I will add environmental law here, and how they come together to protect what has now become climate rights. And of course, we talk about the July 2022 resolution that a clean and healthy and sustainable environment is a human right. So the rights issues too have really evolved. There's a time when we spoke about the right to life. And the right to life in those discussions meant the right to be hung or not to be hanged. But now climate rights have to do with the right to life, has to now deal with the right to a healthy environment, the right to breathe fresh air, and our individual responsibility. So going back now to what is my responsibility? My responsibility is how I manage the natural resources around me. And Professor Taylor spoke about that. So in our own spaces, we perhaps don't live in a forest. He also spoke about indigenous communities, because indigenous communities are known to know how to live with nature. So they don't necessarily have such issues, but the way we live will also impact them. He also spoke about the whole issue of ancestral lands. There are many ancestral lands issues. And I'm not just talking about the fact that you live on the land that your great-great-great-grandfather left for you, like the presentation that was here before. You do have communities that live on ancestral lands. And therefore, how do you protect those lands? And the issue again from the previous presentation, when my land is gone and Melissa has taken it, where are you going to put me? And if the government decides, based on the new infrastructure paradigms in terms of development, if you're going to move me from the coastline, where am I going? By the way, there's work out there for you when you leave here, right? Because there are people out there who don't know what to do. Your land is gone, your house is gone, it wasn't insured. Why? You couldn't afford insurance. As plain as simple. You just could not afford insurance, so you took the chance. Your house is gone, your land is by the coast, and maybe the building code will now say you can't build there. So what do? Does government have a responsibility?
Okay, apart from, I'm looking at the Bernard Lodge development, St. Catherine, expansion of Portmore. Previously, NEPA had said the underground aquifers will be influenced or damaged if they do the development. Then they go back and, I guess, sign it off. The government is acquiring all those lands, expand. And I think Portmore is close to the sea coast, and everybody say fear it's going to be, Portmore is close to the sea coast, and everybody fear it's going to be another Port Royal disaster. God forbid. But these things are happening, and then what do we do if sometimes we just feel that our environment agencies are not working for us, and we're hearing one thing 10 decades ago and then another thing now. And in light of persons wanting houses, I'm not sure how do we balance these things.
You know, I think the word balance is an important word. My personal view as an environmental lawyer is that there's no balance. That's just my view. There's no balance, because I don't know what that would be. But the truth is, post-Melissa is a wake-up call for us as not just Jamaica, but as small island developing states, to determine how do you rebuild, for example. So for example, Professor Taylor spoke about some of the proposed infrastructure requirements. So Hurricane Melissa was what? Category 5. So, and I heard in the discussion when Hurricane Melissa was that wicked little girl just out there lingering in the ocean. And people were saying, has it surpassed 5? In other words, is there something called category 6 and 7? And if that is the case, what are we going to do? How do you prepare for that? How do you prepare housing? How does it affect your culture? And remember too, environment is not divorced from culture. In fact, when you look at environmental law jurisprudence, culture is a part of it. Because how you interface with your environment is a part of your culture. We talk about the ocean, that's a part of your culture, right? So the deprivation, for example, affects cultural norms. It affects how we deal with our own cultural spaces for different reasons. So the question you have asked, I don't think it's an easy question, and I don't know that we have solved the problem with Hurricane Melissa either. If in terms of location of houses, what do you put them? Are you now going to put people in high-rise buildings? Is that part of our culture? Could you, for example, who live in your own home, end up with a high-rise building because that's not what you want? So it really has an impact on our lives. And when Professor Taylor started off first, I said, boy, this sounds like climate Armageddon, right? Because of the seriousness of the context in which we live today and the context in which our children and their children are going to live. Because that's what the future generation is. I remember that is the infinitum in terms of when we talk about generations to come. So we talk about indigenous people. We could get into that here because in Jamaica we have groups who have claimed indigenous status, but the government has not made a decision on that. But that's a discussion that we're actually having now in Jamaica. We have, just for information, we have Tainos in Jamaica who say they exist. The history is wrong. And persons have come forward to say we exist. You can't teach that we are extinct. So there are a lot of issues and rights issues that are emerging that will also have impact as well on climate rights. So I think I can stop here. This is just going through what other countries have said, have spoken about in terms of their own legislation and in terms of court decisions and so on. But if you look at the last sentence on the slide, in terms of the Brazilian courts, that the executive has the constitutional duty to allocate funds to mitigate climate change. So courts are getting involved in the climate change discussion because when it comes onto the role of and responsibility of states under these various pieces of legislation and international agreements, who is going to pronounce on it? When you think about the separation of powers, it is the courts that are going to pronounce on it. And courts are getting more and more involved. Courts are getting involved in environmental impact assessments. Courts are declaring that the environmental impact assessment is substandard and that they must be redone. Courts are making decisions on many things because the rule of law, again, the discussion on the rule of law has to apply. So I'm going to end here. So I just end here and leave us with this slide for us to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Davis Mathis. Can we give her another round of applause, please? As young lawyers in training, I think we are deeply appreciative of your insightful explanation of all of the laws and agreements and policies and how these legal frameworks can be used to essentially mitigate the impacts of climate change. So thank you. At this time, we're opening up the floor for questions, but in the interest of time, we can only take one question per presenter. So if there are any questions.
Good afternoon. Do I need a mic? I talk so very loud. Professor Taylor, I'm just a little mystified. I know we're talking about climate change, but most times when we talk about climate change, we're talking about gas emissions and hurricanes. But I'm wondering, what about the earth tremors that we're having here now in Jamaica? Does that have anything to do with climate change? Or does it? You can sit.
I can sit, thank you. What's an easy answer? No. No, there is very little link between the earth tremors and climate.
Water, and then water affects the air,
there are many ways we can stretch climate, but no, not really.
Thank you, sir. Any oth-
Thank you so much for your presentations. I think climate change, I've seen it in my own lifetime. We used to have May and October rainy season, and you walk home in serious rain and your glasses fog over. Now when the rain falls, it's like, psh, it's not even real rain anymore. But I have a question. Are we also our own enemies as well, in the sense that some of our infrastructure is not held to a standard that is even reasonable, so that, for example, a pothole is fixed today, there's a drizzle tomorrow, not a 5, not a cat 5, a drizzle tomorrow, and the pothole reappears with a sister. So the standards that we need to hold ourselves to of work done, accountability for contractor behavior, and so on, those are some of the things I'm wondering. Today, the dam is full, and in no time, we're in danger again, because what percentage of it is silt? Could we not remove the silt and not put ourselves in this situation? You see what I'm saying? One more example. I know time is, don't run me. But these are things that have been bothering me for a while. I know that I get the mic. But, the other situation that I'm concerned about is something I've always wondered about. Back in the day when I was in management studies, way back, we had a power outage, and the room, this was like maybe 10 o'clock in the morning, and the room was pitch black. You couldn't see a hand in front of you. Why? Not one window. The whole thing was concreted with a tiny, maybe 6 inches of slats just at the base of the wall. The door was wide open just to allow a little air in, and then we all had to just end class because this is a tropical country, and we couldn't make use of the sunlight and the air, and an expensive building. I'm going to wrap up now. But how do we, as we build resilience, and as we put laws in place to enable resilience, how do we tackle the things, the enemy within? Either of you.
I'll start, but that's really Lelita's. One of the things, very recently I had to give a talk post Melissa. I had to give a lecture post Melissa. And one of the things I indicated, so I spoke about Melissa revealing that we have a conceivability gap. And by that I meant there's a gap between what we thought Melissa should have done and what Melissa actually did, right? And then I tried to look on what contributed to that conceivability gap. And I won't go through the lecture again, but the first one was a standards gap. It turns out that the kind of standards we were building for never accounted for climate change. And so the challenge is, climate change before used to be a background consideration. Let's just call it climate. But no, you can't treat climate in that kind of way. So it means that we really have to go back and look on the building codes again, and decide how do we actually rewrite these building codes so that they meet those standards. And it's not just the building codes, you talk about it, it's the road, how we fill a pothole, and fill it, and it keeps coming back. And so now we have the real challenge of putting climate change front and center in our planning and in all of those policies, etc., that are being spoken to. We really have to take that seriously now. I have a real worry for the fact that we are in March. Beryl came in June. So we are 5 months away from the next hurricane season. you heard yesterday on the radio that I think our Prime Minister said we're now moving out of the, the, the first phase into recovery now. And it's a real question I ask you. Who is looking on those buildings that are going back up and those roofs that are going back up? Because in 5 months, we may be tested again, and we can't afford for the things. But that will only happen if we now recognize climate change as front and center and put it into the plans. And here's a good example of where we should be doing that right now with those. That's the only thing that, that. But I'd allow Lalita to.
I won't add much, but just to say, standards are also legislated. Remember that. So, and you have to enforce them. But I think one of the dilemma now is, I don't think we really know what to do. I really don't think we know what to do, because as the question is, suppose you had a category 6 in the next 2 years. The code you're putting in now, right? The code you're putting in now, will that withstand the category 6? And I think the other thing we need to recognize is that historically and culturally, we have some serious infrastructure problems, right? Because we never had a solid infrastructure on independence. And there are some things we need to understand. We need to also understand that when it comes down to Western Jamaica, for example, Westmoreland, from where I'm from, you have to understand the culture behind the houses, You have done land law and you have done the law of chattel and fixtures. That's what this is about, That is all that is about. Because persons, if you don't own land, you can't put a fixture on the land. So you buy the chattel and you put it on blocks on the land that you have leased or rented. When the landlord sends you on, you move it to the next spot. It's not because people want board house. It's because you can't do otherwise, because to do otherwise would be foolish. It is not yours. You already have enough problems trying to claim ancestral lands to say my great-grandmother left it for me. Most as you are paying for the least piece of, and it's a house plot. So if when you look at Melissa and you looked at some of the testimonials coming out, you will see that one entire family had 5 houses and 1 piece of land, because each daughter or son would have a house. That is the culture of the place. So it's not because people are poor and they want to build. That's not it. So when I spoke about environment and culture, one of the things we have to understand, you cannot divorce culture from the environment. You just can't. And so you have to look at it. We're talking about Professor Taylor just asked, what about the roofs that are going on? You can't put certain roof on certain infrastructure. You just can't do it. In fact, people are being warned about putting on certain types of roof if the structure can't support it. But as you said, who is doing all of that? And is that the government's responsibility? That's also a question. Is that the government's responsibility? Is the government going to give us all houses? It's a question for us also as citizens to also answer. Because now we form part of that public consultation that I referred to before.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. On behalf of Group M, second year, Norman Manley Law School, the Norman Manley Law School Legal Aid Clinic, and the wider fraternity, we extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Michael Taylor and Mrs. Lalita Davis Mathis for their outstanding presentations at our climate change book seminar during the Norman Manley Law School Legal Aid Clinic Fair. Your willingness to share your time, your expertise, and insights greatly enriched the experience for everyone who visited us and engaged with us, including our online guests. We thank you. Your presentations not only deepened our understanding of the legal dimensions of climate change, but also inspired meaningful discussion and reflection on the role we each play in shaping a more sustainable future. the clarity, oh, the passion is there, and the professionalism you both brought truly elevated the standard of our exhibit. We are deeply appreciated. Thank you for your support and contribution, and we thank you for helping to make our participation in the Norman Manley Law School Legal Aid Clinic Fair both impactful and memorable. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Come to you.
Thank you, everyone, once again. At this time, we would have Miss Gabrielle Simmons and Miss Nastasia Morrison of Seminar Group M to present our presenters with a token of our appreciation, both on behalf of Group M as well as the Legal Aid Clinic of the Law School.